So by way of background, I am probably, although Mike and I are almost identical ages, and we actually worked together before CD Now. My favorite CD Now joke, incidentally, we had a Drexel co-op who worked with us and then went on to CD Now. He watched these, but the best line ever about CD Now, he said, "Now you got to put your heads back, when it was a long time ago." He said, "CD Now, if I want a CD now, I'm going to go to Tower. This is CD later." So Real Food Works is my 5th startup. So I've done this a lot. I've probably failed more spectacularly and more often than every one of you in the room. And so it was really hard to take 10 minutes and figure out what to talk about. And I will say also, that was over once I got over what felt like a slightly insulting request to come talk about your failures. That's what I'm known for.
No shame.
No shame from the technically Philly crowd. So I thought what I would do is strip away all this, and I'll talk a little bit differently than maybe some of the other speakers, and part of it maybe is my age. You get more philosophical as you get older, and realize that the things that really matter are actually the deeper things. And so I'm going to tell you just one story, which was my most spectacular failure. I read recently a great quote. Bill Campbell, I'm currently have a business crush on Bill Campbell, and he had a great line about Go, and if people want to know about failure, go read about Go. It's one of the most spectacular failures in the history of tech. And his line was, "We left no skid marks when we went over the edge of that cliff." So I'm a little bit different philosophically maybe than Mike is, which if you knew us well would surprise you. So I had a company that I was CEO of. I didn't found. I was the 3rd employee, called Destiny Software. It was founded in '95. I went there from Infonautics, where Mike and I worked together, which is another great case study we should do sometime. We had unbelievable degrees of success. And so I hate the fact that the things I'm about to say to you are in my bio, but and I certainly don't feel 100% comfortable sharing them, but I will because you need it for the context. This is a company that was number 32 on the Inc. 500 list. It was the 2nd fastest growing company in the United States. I won the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year award. I was CEO of the Year in a competition that had CEO of the Year under 40. I was 37 and won the whole thing. We grew like a weed. We grew to a little over 25 million in sales and extreme profitability. We were at an EBITDA line of over $5 million on 25 million and growing at sort of 40-50% rate. It was company was really unbelievably successful. We raised 3 rounds of venture capital along the way. We said no to a number of acquisition offers, real offers, term sheet offers we walked from. And then 2 things happened. The first thing that happened was the bubble burst. So I do look around and say there's a lot of people in this room who don't really know in your gut what that was like. It was it was unfathomable what happened. Overnight, business just evaporated. It was an amazing thing that happened, and most of our major competitors went bankrupt after that first go-round, and these were competitors, so it was the era that Mike was talking about. So numbers like $100 million was a huge number then in the way it isn't now. And we had competitors who had raised over $100 million, and they just went bankrupt. And we were still standing. But it was tough. So what that company did was we had a combination. We had a software platform, and then we did consulting services around that platform to put banks and other financial institutions online. So we built the very first consumer financial transaction system there was, which was Vanguard's AOL system. We started on AOL. This is how old I am. So that you could actually trade stocks. We built Bank of America's AOL and then web systems. We were First USA, as people around then, First USA ruled the credit card business. We built all of their application systems. So we were, that's sort of what we were doing. And so when the bubble burst, in those days what was happening in the large companies was everybody was worried about being dot-bombed. And the idea was if you couldn't, as a big company, figure out how to get online, some little upstart, a CD Now, was going to come at Columbia Records' heels and eat your business. And all of a sudden, overnight, that evaporated. So what happened was, so I was like 35 or something, and I went to my board right after this, early first quarter of 2001, and 2001, is that right? I never get numbers right. That's another thing Mike and I are different. We always get the numbers right. So I went to my board, and the board was a big deal. I had the chairman of Mellon Bank and all these kind of people and VCs, and I said, we are so screwed. This is going to be terrible. And they said to me, what's the next quarter look like? And I said, well, we're going to be up 20% and profitability is increasing and whatever. And they said to me, literally direct quote from a bunch of 50-plus white guys, you're young, you've never lived through a business cycle, you're overreacting, don't do anything. I'm not really the best person around at following direction. And I just knew I was right. I knew it was going to be a bloodbath. And so I battened down the hatches. As an entrepreneur, life is cash. That is all that matters, is whether you have cash or access to cash. And so I took what was already a profitable company and laid off. We had, I don't know, probably 150 people at that, 175 people, and we laid off probably 75 of them immediately. Everybody who was in sort of the growth, anybody who was an investment, was gone. Unbelievably painful. This was a company that had the lowest turnover in our industry by about half. We were about half of the next lowest. But we needed cash. So we actually improved performance. So for about 3 quarters, the top line grew precipitously. The profitability was insane because I wasn't doing any investing for the future. And I knew this is what was going to happen. Those big guys, it just takes them a long time to get those ships moved around, and they got those ships moved around. And we started to see the business turn, but just started. And it looked like we were going to be able to hold flat. And then, 9/11. And our largest contracts, we did very large contracts. This was a company that did deals like between $1 and $5 million. Our largest contract was with the Bank of New York. The Bank of New York had a prescient IT management staff, which had put their main data center on one side of the World Trade Center and their backup data center in a separate electric grid on the other side of the World Trade Center. And the entire bank literally went down. They had no ATM network for 6 months. Needless to say, there went my contract. Soon after that, Citigroup closed all new spending. It just went through. And so we then watched the business, which had flattened, start to do this, and it just kept going down. I described it at the time, it was like you're on a very steep incline hill and it was just solid mud. And as soon as I felt like I got my feet underneath me, something would happen and you'd lose it again. And through this process, I think one of the things we did really well was I just kept having to lay people off. So we would do it in groups. We did 3 of them, huge groups of people. I did it personally, sat with every person. And we just kept, and we amassed cash. So I just kept amassing cash, thinking this is life, we'll live to play another day. And it became clear, meanwhile, the business is in trouble. We did eventually stabilize it at about 12 million in sales. And then you'd sort of take your head up and realize that valuations had been crushed, probably never to recover. So you're looking at a company that before all this happened was probably worth somewhere in the range of 10 times revenue. We were now like 0.9 times revenue. In other words, I had to be 10 times as big to be worth what I was worth before. And we had, so we had some business, we had money in the bank, we had very supportive investors, they loved us through this process, and we had a really great team. And the investors had a lot of confidence in my team and me. And so we got this bright idea that what we would do is we'd go buy something. Because at this point now we're sort of past that the terrible trough. And there was a lot of detritus lying around, right? A lot of companies who got in trouble where there was some technology, but there wasn't really a company around it, it wasn't anywhere. So we lay out all the parameters for what we're looking for. We go find a deal, and I brought it back to the board, and it was voted down primarily in an effort led by our first round, our Series A investors. And so we redefined what it was we were looking for, and we went out and did it again. I did it mostly internally. We had some help with some consultants, but I didn't hire a banker. And I found literally the perfect company, a little company called Elodie in New Jersey. And I'm good friends with the CEO still today. And we brought it back to the board, and it was blocked again by the Series A investor. And a 3-hour board meeting turned into a 9-hour board meeting where we talk about my beloved Steve Goodman. I've called him my fairy godfather. I literally called Steve and said, you need to come to this meeting because somebody is going to get sued. This is really going to be ugly. And the as condensed as I can make it version of what was happening was, I know now, I didn't know then, that Series A investors fund was in real trouble. They literally had not had a single exit event. They basically saw the opportunity to liquidate the company. They had redemption rights. We were 5 years in at this point, 7-year redemption typical. They had redemption rights coming in 2 years. I didn't have enough cash to pay for the redemption, buy this company, and then operate the combined companies while we figured it out and grew again. And so we liquidated a company with $12 million in revenue and $10 million in the bank. You want to talk failure? 5 years of my life. The investors made out better or worse depending on where they were in the stack. The early guys actually did quite well. The later guys lost money, but not all of it. And in those days, actually, those vintage funds, we were one of the top performers having returned anything, right? It was the complete wasteland in funds in that era. So that's how that's an unusual denouement for a company that is pretty successful, and is successful in lots of ways. I would echo what Mike said about CD Now. Our employees had an amazing time. Our customers were super happy. We had great partnerships, dear friendships. The founder from that company and I are literally like brother and sister. We're that close. So we got an awful lot out of it. But it certainly wasn't a business success, and I didn't make any money. When it ended, I was 6 months pregnant with my second daughter. That is not really an optimal state to look for your next gig. And my next thing, I'm not going to go into it at all, but I want to tell the arc of the story. So I then co-founded a company in January 2004 called Turntide, which was an anti-spam company. And we put $700,000 in it, raised $700,000, and we sold it in June for $28 million. So it all worked out okay for me in the end. But it was quite a ride, and really sad for a lot of other folks, and I would say it didn't work out so well for the founder, financially at least. So that's an example of a failure where, talk about snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Is that right? Yeah. What are the lessons in that? I could go on endlessly with sort of the list of things you learn and how not to raise capital and how to structure deals and all kinds of stuff. Candidly, for this crowd, you'd need like an Oxford dictionary length of the things that you would need to learn at that level. What I want to share with you is what I think is at the core of failure and this question, which is a much more fundamental thing. And that's about how you feel as a founder or a CEO, which I think is unique when you're failing in that way. It is really horrible. I mean, really horrible. It is losing one of the most important things in your life and feeling responsible for it. Right? It's not sleeping, but it's not sleeping in sort of a way you throw that around. It is being so deeply miserable and stuck and still having to get up the next day and do it, and being responsible for 100 people while you do that, and tens of millions of dollars while you do that. There is really, I can't say that I have done anything harder in my life. It isn't the same. I've got wonderful kids. It's not quite at the level. It's pretty damn close, right? It is that difficult. And so what do you do? How do you manage yourself? What does that mean? Well, first thing I would say, and I do this to my advice, use the same advice all the time in all kinds of circumstances, and despite how heavy that is, I use it here. Life goes on. You know what? We're all going to die at the end. It doesn't really get much worse than that. Life goes on. Here I am, right? I now have a company I love more than any one I've ever done before. And I've got a wonderful life and all the rest of it. And so what you have to do is just look at failure and take those unbelievably intense, terrible feelings and put them aside. Because what I find is, one of my specific piece of advice is to ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen in this game we play is you fail. We're not neurosurgeons, right? Is that you fail. And you know what? The fear of failure and all the stuff that you bring to that game is the problem. It's not the failure itself. You will go on, right? If you have to work at Starbucks for a year, okay, don't work at Starbucks for a year. You're worried, most people I find, the overwhelming worry about failure is what people are going to think of me. Guess what? Who the fuck cares what anybody thinks about you? They never walked in your shoes. They never tried to do. The people who are going to judge you are the people who never did shit in their lives. Right? There's all those stupid Michael Jordan quotes about you. That's all stuff you bring to it. So don't bring it. Just don't bring it, and it's fine. It doesn't mean it's going to be fun or easy. But when I was in the depth of failing, right? This company was everywhere. I was on the cover of all the magazines and the big pictures and all. This thing was extremely visible. When I was in the depths of it and really the core of that, none of that mattered at all. I didn't care what anybody thought. When you're in it, it just doesn't matter. What matters is what's happening to your people, what's happening to your customers, that's the stuff that matters. So before you get there, why worry about all this other junk that you're not even going to worry about once you get there? Doesn't make any sense, right? So that's my lesson from failure. It is really that bad, right? There's a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's actually critical to understand if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, which is the Stockdale paradox. Anyone ever heard of the Stockdale paradox? So you know Jim Stockdale, right? He was the blew it completely in the vice presidential debate. Stockdale was. Which is unfortunate that was the end of his career. He's actually sort of an amazing guy. I disagree with him politically, but he was sort of an amazing guy. And he was a prisoner of war. And he actually wrote a great book. And he makes an observation about prisoners of war, which is completely true for entrepreneurs. When you look at prisoners of war, there's really three categories of people in terms of the psychology they bring to it. The first are the pessimists. I'm going to die, this is terrible, whatever. They die basically right away. Because a lot of being a prisoner of war, right, is tenacity in sort of the most extreme sense, right? The second set of people to die were the optimists. I'm not going to get tortured today, it's going to be fine, someone's going to save us. By the time you get to the 6th month of you did get tortured today, and nobody is going to save you, those people die. The people who live are the people who say, it is really terrible today, but it's not always going to be terrible. And as an entrepreneur, you're going to have these crazy, right? What is Andreessen Mark Andreessen has this great saying about it, I can't think of it now. I can't think of it. It's like you only have the top and the bottom. Basically, you don't have this middle. It doesn't exist. It's either absolutely exhilarating, it's awesome, or it's terrible, and they happen within 10 minutes of each other. So you have to be able to manage your emotion through that. And that's really the key, is managing that emotion. And that's how I got through it. Was thinking like, this is really this terrible. I am going to go fire 35 of my best friends, and it's my fault, and I have to do that, and I don't know how they're going to pay their mortgages. But it's not always going to be that way. So that's my story, and those are my comments. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah.
No, they all know exactly what to do now.
Yeah, when you were in that board meeting,
Yeah.
faced with that investor, what could you have done legally to actually force an acquisition?
I really couldn't. They had a pretty strong, they had the rights block, and they had redemption rights coming. So I could have just done it anyway, but, I couldn't have just done it anyway because the other investors wouldn't have been supportive, because they would have known that the next step was we were going to have a problem, right? So it just was what it was. I don't think that there's really anything that could have been done differently from a legal perspective. I think the lesson actually in there is more about how unimportant contracts and all that are, right? It's more about, that was sort of really there are two things I learned from that in the specifics. One is it was just a dastardly thing to do, and so you got to be pretty clear about who you work with. And I did all the right things to try. Actually, I did all the right things to try to know that, but it turned out, and when people get in really tough spots, they do things that they don't do when they're not in tough spots. So it's hard to predict. The second thing that I would say I learned that's really hard, and this is actually a very specific piece of advice for people who raise venture money, is a venture investor is a business partner. You need to understand their business. Where are they in their fund? How much time do you really have? Have they had exits or have they not? All that stuff. And I wasn't sophisticated. I had two things. I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand that at that time. But in addition to that, VCs don't like you to know that. Right, Brett? I think he gets applause for being the only VC who's like willing to show his face at the failure. That's good.
We have more than they will. We have whole portfolios. We're going to have fun.
You're going to have failures for sure. So I think there's a little bit more openness about that now, but generally they do not like you to know their business, and I think that's unfortunate. The further you get along in your career, the more you're able to force that. But I think that's the key thing. If I had really understood where they were, I probably could have gotten ahead of it somehow and figured out something. It wouldn't have been legal. It would have been, okay, you got this, I got this. How do we find some solution here? Yeah.
So after you failed, how did you go about going from there to finding your next idea? Did you go through a phase to figure out your next thing, or?
So I now, 5 in, I now actually have a pretty disciplined process, and I know how to do that. At the time, it was, first of all, I had a baby. I'm breadwinner. My husband doesn't stay at home with our girls, so it was, and I had been making, the company was doing really well. I was making a good salary, but I literally walked away with no capital gain from it. And so I was feeling really a lot of pressure to actually bring income in. We had built a huge house and all this stuff. And so what actually happened was I just started consulting. And it was pretty, because I had all these accolades and everything. Oh, my favorite one I forgot to tell you was I was named one of the top 10 most influential consultants in America by Consulting Magazine, which I love because I went to Wharton, and I did the convocation one year, and they all went, you go to Wharton, that's sort of a big consulting thing. And in fact, the way it happened was I sat next to this guy at lunch, and I think they needed a woman in the list of 10. And so, anyway, I did a lot of publicity, so I was pretty well known, and I think most of the venture community knew me and stuff. And so I got a lot of consulting gigs, and I was doing these very structured, sort of do strategic reviews and operational reviews of companies. And along that way, I just met a lot of people. And so it turned out it happened because a guy who had been was another CEO of another portfolio company in the same in one of the VCs we had who failed. He went off the cliff with $35 million. I only went off with 10. Wanted me to come run his company for him. He wanted me to be chairman and CEO, and I really didn't want to do that for a whole set of reasons, but they had this technology I fell in love with. And so my co-founder at Turntide, people may know David Bruson, who went on to found Monate, where I was the founding outside board member. And so I basically founded a new co, and I bought Bruson and the technology stock, and so it was just an accident of having run into him. I think one of the things, though, if you do this well, if you're an entrepreneur, you in this game, in the high growth tech game, you better be able to get your ass up quick after you fall, because you're going to fall every day. You're going to fall all the time. Now that story I told you is a particularly large fall. But you have to be able to manage yourself. I'm reading, if people haven't, Ben Horowitz's new book is great, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And he talks about this, is that really the critical attribute of a good startup CEO is self-management, is can you manage your emotion? So you got to be able to get up and put that jacket on, put that uniform on, and go in the game. And I think that it's just a bigger version of the same thing that you have to do every single day. I think they're out of questions.
Yeah, I think we're time. So let's thank Lucinda.
Thanks, everybody.